That was back in 1916. He was picking corn, and a horse kicked him. I think it was a horse. I don't think it was a mule. I think it was a horse. The horse kicked him and broke his leg, and so he had to go to the hospital in Sioux City, St. Vincent's Hospital, which at that time was not finished. It was in use, but they hadn't completed the work on it. So he was in there for quite a while. You know, in those days, it was easy to get into a hospital, but hard to get out. Now it's the other way around. It's difficult to get in, and they make you leave whether you're ready or not in a day or two. But he spent time in the hospital quite a while. He stood up on the leg, and of course the bone came out through it. So he was in there quite a while. And then Grandpa went to bring him home, and somewhere or another they missed the train, so he had to stay another night, which was no big deal. But those days that would be the only way to travel. You know, horse and buggy would have been extremely slow, and there were no roads to begin with. They used to say that the Walshes, went back in the early days, if they'd drive into Sioux City with perhaps some livestock to sell or something, they'd always make it a point to get out of South Sioux before dark, because South Sioux at that time was known as Covington, part of it. It was a pretty wild place. A lot of saloons and a lot of violence and all kinds of crime. Every now and then they decide to clean up Sioux City, so the criminals would come across the river and operate out of South Sioux for a while. But it didn't have a very savory reputation in those days. I remember that. But anyway, he was in the hospital for I don't know how long. It was quite a while, and it wasn't done. There was a nurse from Newcastle, Miss Tobin. She was in nurse's training at the time when he was in there. When I was in there in 1951, she was still there. She wasn't in training. I mean, obviously then she was a senior nurse, but she spent her whole career in St. Vincent's and most of her life. And St. Vincent's is now called Mercy Hospital. It's downtown Sioux City, and they're still part of the old building in use. Most of it has been redone and replaced a number of times. Yeah, well, our Uncle Bill had cancer. He came here for Dick's funeral in 1959, which was the last time we saw him. That was in October of 59, and then in the summer of 1960, we got a phone call that he was very sick. He had cancer. And he was in the hospital in Campbellsville, and then they took him to a hospital in Louisville, where he died. My mother and Dad and Aunt Margaret and Aunt Mary went to the funeral. John and Aunt Gertrude went too. They went a few days early, hoping that they could get there before he died, which they did not. He died before they got to Kentucky. So they all went to the funeral. I was working, I couldn't go, and Louise was working, couldn't go. And that's the day we froze all the sweet corn. That's Saturday, you know, while they were gone. She worked in the bank that morning, and I worked at AO, and we came home and picked all the sweet corn, or most of it anyway, and froze it. So we used to freeze sweet corn every year. I don't even raise it now, but it was very good sweet corn. And of course he died and left a wife and 5 children. Pat was grown up. Bob was pretty well grown up. Well, Bob was grown up. The rest of them were not. They were still at home. And then his wife went to work in the hospital as a nurse's aide, and they lived in Campbellsville, Kentucky. And later on, they all grew up, graduated from schools. A couple of them went to college. There was a college in Campbellsville. A couple of them went there. Louis went on to do a suburb of Detroit, Clinton Township it's called, and he's lived there ever since. He's still working at age 75. Lawrence went into the Air Force. He was at SAC for 4 years. I went down and visited him a couple of times. And then when they went to Kentucky, when they got out of the Air Force, Bob came up to get them, and they all came up here for just a couple of days. And of course, we had a good time then. And that's the last time I saw Bob. He, in the spring of 1976, I think it was, actually early in the winter, he didn't feel good. He went to a doctor, said, "You've got flu." 3 weeks later, he wasn't any better. Went back again, "Oh, it's just flu." Then finally, he was sent to an ophthalmologist who diagnosed a brain tumor. So he had multiple malignant brain tumors. And he lived until October. He was very sick, though. I think he lost his vision, I'm sure, from the brain tumors. And then finally in October, he died. He had a wife and 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Some of them were pretty small at the time. We don't hear much from them anymore. Lawrence doesn't hear much from them either. Oh, yeah, it was 1962. I didn't go. I was working in August. The company I worked for, nobody could be gone because it was our busiest season. But they went to Kentucky, and so you would have seen Bob then. That was, I wasn't on at that time. And then in 1963, Mom and I went down there, and Aunt Mary went too. We went to Kentucky. I know we came to some place where there was a ferry boat. You had to take a ferry boat across the river. And I think it was while we were waiting for the ferry boat, and of course, optical illusions, but she said, "Well, the ground moved." But anyway, we made it to Kentucky and spent a few days there, and then came back to Springfield and came back on home. That was in 1963. And then none of them have died since. They're all living. Pat's husband has died. He was just about 90 years old, and Pat is about 86 or 7, and doing quite well. Still lives in her own house in Greensburg. Lawrence lives in Greensburg too, and Louis is in Detroit. William is in Campbellsville, the town where they grew up. And Rose is a nurse, but she's retired. She had 2 children. She lives in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, and they were here, but it's a long time ago. They were here in 92, and they were here in 94. In 94, they came in June. Everything looked beautiful. The corn was ahead of schedule. Everything looked real nice. Well, then June 24th of 1994, we had a tremendous hailstorm on a Saturday afternoon, late afternoon, and it seemed like where we live was ground zero. It just destroyed everything. It broke windows, and the corn crop in most cases wasn't worth picking. There was just nothing left of it. It was, if it had been a little smaller, it might not have suffered as bad. So the soybeans did recover to some extent and yielded about 20 bushels, which isn't much, but better than nothing. The corn was, most cases, wasn't even worth picking. The only place there was any corn was around the edge of the fields where there were trees, so that the trees shelter them a little bit from the hailstorm. But it was weird. I remember looking out, and there's a creek, ditch, you want to call it, south of the house, and there was a cloud coming down that I wanted to go to the basement, but Mom wouldn't do it. And Donnie was gone. He was at his high school class reunion over in South Dakota. I'd been to town. Fortunately, I had put the car in the garage, and I was mowing, but fortunately I'd put the mower away. Otherwise, they would have been destroyed. But we got it, I think, worse than anybody.